The impossible warmth. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into a winter night on the northern plains. The year is 1852, January. The kind of cold that makes your breath freeze in your lungs before you can exhale it. 30 degrees below zero, and the wind, always the wind, sweeping across a landscape so vast it makes you feel like an insect crawling across an infinite table. No trees for 100 miles, no shelter that you would recognize. Nothing between you and the Arctic but grass, frozen solid and brittle as glass. And yet, in this void of cold, in this desert of ice and wind, families are sleeping. Not huddled in misery, not dying slowly of exposure, but sleeping soundly, comfortably, warmly. Children dream without shivering. Elders rest without the rattle of hypothermia in their chests. Infants nurse and coo, their tiny bodies relaxed in genuine warmth. The shelter protecting them? 20 buffalo hides sewn together and stretched over wooden poles. A structure so simple it can be assembled in an hour and disassembled in less. A home that weighs perhaps 200 pounds when packed, light enough to be transported by a single horse. Walls less than a quarter-inch thick in most places, nothing more than animal skin standing between human life and a cold that could kill an exposed person in less than 20 minutes. How is this possible? How did entire civilizations thrive for thousands of years in conditions that would defeat modern camping equipment? How did mothers raise healthy babies in shelters that appear, to our modern eyes, to be nothing more than decorated tents? The answer lies in knowledge so sophisticated, it challenges everything we think we understand about heat, shelter, and survival. Knowledge that was perfected over millennia, passed down through generations with the care reserved for the most precious treasures, and then, in the space of a single lifetime, nearly lost forever. Tonight, we are going to uncover that knowledge together. We are going to step back into a world where staying warm was not a matter of adjusting a thermostat, but an art form practiced every single day with precision, skill, and an understanding of physics that would impress modern engineers. Before we begin this journey, I want to ask a small favor. If you are ready to explore this forgotten world with me, tap that like button. It helps this story reach others who might find comfort and wonder in these late-night histories. And subscribe if you want to make this a regular part of your evening routine. I share stories like this several times a week, each one designed to help you wind down and drift peacefully towards sleep. Now, tell me in the comments, where are you right now? Are you in bed in California as midnight approaches, sitting in a chair in London as dawn creeps closer, lying on a couch in Sydney as afternoon fades? I love seeing how far this little circle of history lovers extends across the world. Settle in. Maybe adjust your pillow. Let your breathing slow. Perhaps turn on a fan or some white noise if you like that gentle background hum. Tonight, we are traveling to a time when warmth was something you created with your own hands. When comfort required wisdom your grandmother's grandmother carried in her bones. When the difference between a peaceful night and a frozen death was knowledge measured in tiny details most people never noticed. The wind is rising outside those buffalo hide walls. The temperature is dropping as the sun disappears beyond the western horizon, painting the snow in shades of purple and blue. Inside, a fire no bigger than a large cooking pot glows steady and warm. 8 people prepare for sleep, arranging robes, banking coals, adjusting ventilation with movements so practiced they seem like ritual. Let us step inside and see how they survived. Better yet, how they thrived, how they stayed not just alive, but genuinely, remarkably, impossibly warm. A night on the frozen plains, December 1848. A Cheyenne winter camp along the Platte River in what will someday be called Nebraska. You are 14 years old, born in the spring when the grass first greened and the buffalo calves took their first wobbling steps beside their mothers. You have lived through 14 winters now, but each one still feels like a test you might fail if you forget even a single lesson your mother has spent years teaching you. The day is ending. The sun, pale and distant as a memory, has already touched the horizon, and you can feel the temperature beginning its nightly plunge. By midnight, it will be cold enough to kill. By dawn, the water in the leather bags will be frozen solid despite hanging inside the lodge. This is normal. This is expected. This is what winter means on the plains. Your name, in the language of your people, means follows the birds, given to you because as an infant you would turn your head to track the flight of hawks and eagles overhead. Today, you have spent the hours since dawn gathering the materials that will keep your family alive through another night. Buffalo chips, the dry dung that burns slow and steady, producing heat that lasts far longer than wood and smoke that is less harsh on the eyes and throat. You have filled 3 large parfleche bags with chips, selecting each one carefully. The fresh ones, still soft, you left behind. They will not burn properly. The ones from last summer, dried hard as stone by months of sun and wind, these are what you gathered. Each chip was examined, tested between your fingers for the right density, the right dryness, the right age. Your mother taught you to recognize quality by touch alone, and now, after years of practice, you rarely choose poorly. The work has left your hands cracked and raw, despite the bear grease your grandmother rubbed into them this morning. The cold finds every tiny fissure in your skin, every small cut, every place where the skin is worn thin from labor. But this pain is familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. It means you are doing what needs to be done. It means your family will be warm tonight. You have also gathered wood, though wood is precious and scarce this far onto the prairie. A mile from camp, where the river curves and creates a small shelter of land from the prevailing wind, you found a stand of cottonwoods. Among them, you collected deadfall, branches that had fallen naturally, already seasoned by weather, ready to burn. The wood is not as good as the oak or ash that grows in the mountains 3 days' ride to the west, but it will burn hotter than buffalo chips. And sometimes, when the cold is deepest, that extra heat means the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. The walk back to camp, laden with fuel, has taken an hour. Your shoulders ache from the weight. Your feet, even inside their double-layered moccasins with the fur turned inward, have gone numb. But as you crest the small rise that shields the camp from the worst of the north wind, you see smoke rising from 40 tepees, thin streams of gray against the darkening sky. And you feel something warm in your chest that has nothing to do with physical temperature. Home. Not a place, because this camp will move with the seasons, following the buffalo, the grass, the weather patterns that govern all life on the plains. Home is the people inside those lodges, the patterns of life that repeat themselves with comforting regularity, the knowledge that you belong to something larger than yourself. Your family's lodge stands near the center of the camp, positioned carefully to balance proximity to the creek for water, with shelter from the wind, and access to the common areas where the band gathers for ceremonies and councils. The lodge is 15 feet across at the base, tapering to a smoke hole at the top where the poles cross. 13 buffalo hides, taken from cows killed in their prime, tanned and sewn with sinew thread by your mother and aunts over the course of an entire summer, form the outer covering. But what you cannot see from outside, what visitors never understand until they experience it themselves, is the complexity of the inner structure. The dew cloth, an inner lining of lighter hides, hangs suspended from the lodge poles about 6 feet from the ground, creating a double wall that transforms the simple teepee into a sophisticated climate control system. The airspace between the outer cover and inner lining acts as insulation, while the way the lining is positioned forces cold air entering at ground level to flow upward through this space, warming as it rises and helping to draw smoke from the fire up and out through the smoke hole at the top. You push aside the entrance flap, a carefully fitted door of thick hide that can be adjusted to seal tightly against the cold, or open to allow air circulation, depending on the weather and the fire's behavior. The difference between outside and inside is immediate and remarkable. Your breath, which has been forming visible clouds in the outside air, becomes invisible. The wind, which has been a constant presence in your ears for hours, fades to a whisper barely audible through the hide walls. The interior is dim, lit only by the fire burning in its shallow pit at the center of the lodge, and by the last light of day filtering through the translucent hide walls. But the warmth is real and substantial. Not the fierce heat of a summer day, but a gentle, even warmth that seeps into your cold, stiffened muscles and makes you aware of just how tense you have been against the cold. Your mother looks up from her work. She is making moccasins, her hands moving with the economy of motion that comes from decades of practice, pushing an all-through tough hide, drawing sinew thread after it, creating stitches so small, and even they seem like the work of a machine rather than human hands. She nods toward the wood and buffalo chips you carry, a gesture that means both thank you and well done. Your father sits across the fire, working on arrows. Each shaft must be perfectly straight, perfectly balanced, perfectly matched to the bow that will send it flying toward the buffalo or deer that will feed the family. He shapes them with a careful scraping tool made from a buffalo's shoulder blade, testing each one by rolling it against his thigh, feeling for any wobble or imperfection that might send the arrow off course when accuracy means the difference between eating and going hungry. Your grandmother occupies the place of honor, the warmest spot in the lodge, directly across from the entrance and closest to the fire, without being so close that sparks might land on her or her belongings. She is old now, perhaps 60 winters, though no one counts with certainty. Her face is a map of years spent on the plains, creased by sun and wind and the constant squinting against the bright light that reflects off snow and summer grass. But her hands are still steady, still strong, and tonight she is working on a parfleche, painting geometric designs onto rawhide with brushes made from buffalo bone and dyes extracted from plants and minerals. Your two younger sisters sit near the entrance, the coolest part of the lodge, but also the place where young people are expected to position themselves, ready to help with whatever tasks the adults need. They are playing a game with small sticks and pebbles, their voices soft murmurs that add to the peaceful atmosphere of the evening preparations. And your baby brother, not yet walking, lies in his cradleboard near the fire, wrapped so securely in soft rabbit fur that only his face is visible. His eyes follow the play of firelight on the lodge walls, and occasionally he makes small, contented sounds that make your mother smile, even as her hands continue their steady work. This is your universe. 8 people in a space perhaps 12 feet across, living in intimacy that would seem unbearable to modern sensibilities, but which feels natural and right to you. Each person has their role, their space, their responsibilities. Each person's warmth contributes to the whole, and the whole keeps everyone alive. You add your fuel to the carefully organized pile near the fire, separating the wood from the buffalo chips, arranging everything so it will be easy to reach in the darkness of night when the fire needs feeding. Your mother has taught you that organization is not merely tidiness, but survival. In the middle of a winter night, when the fire burns low and someone must rise to add fuel in darkness, fumbling and confusion waste, precious heat and risk letting the fire die entirely. The fire itself is a marvel you have learned to appreciate only as you have grown old enough to understand its complexity. It burns in a shallow pit lined with stones, each stone selected for its ability to hold heat without cracking or exploding when exposed to high temperatures. The flames never rise more than a foot above the pit, but they burn steadily, fed by a mixture of cottonwood coals at the base for long-lasting heat and buffalo chips on top for quick warmth. Around the fire, placed with geometric precision, are larger stones that have been heating since midday. These river rocks, smooth and dense, absorb heat for hours and will continue radiating warmth long after the visible flames die down to coals. Your grandmother taught your mother, and your mother has taught you, exactly how to position these stones for maximum efficiency. Too close to the fire, and they crack from thermal shock. Too far away, and they do not heat properly. The placement must be perfect. The floor of the lodge is layered with materials that create insulation between your body and the frozen ground below. First, a layer of sagebrush and sweet grass, aromatic plants that release their scent when walked upon and help mask the inevitable odors of too many people living in too small a space. Above this, willow branches arranged to create air pockets, dead air being one of nature's best insulators. Above the willow, buffalo robes with the hair side up, creating a carpet that is genuinely warm to sit or lie upon. And finally, for sleeping, more robes that can be wrapped around the body or shared between family members to create warm cocoons against the night. As darkness falls completely, your mother begins the evening meal. The pot, made from the stomach lining of a buffalo and waterproofed with careful treatment, hangs from a tripod over the fire. It has been simmering since morning with water, dried meat, prairie turnips, and wild onions. The smell fills the lodge, rich and savory, making your mouth water despite the pemmican you ate at midday. She stirs with a ladle carved from buffalo horn, tasting, adding a pinch of dried sage, tasting again. The meal is not elaborate by the standards of the summer camps when fresh meat is plentiful and variety is possible, but it is hot and nourishing, and the warmth it puts into your belly is as important as the warmth radiating from the fire. You eat in comfortable silence, each person receiving their portion according to their needs and status. Your grandmother gets the richest pieces of meat. Your father gets a larger portion because his body burns more fuel in his work as a hunter. The children receive smaller amounts, but with the choicest tender bits that are easiest to chew. This is not inequality, but wisdom, each person receiving what they need to stay healthy and strong. After the meal, as your mother cleans the pot with snow brought in from outside, and your father continues his arrow making, your grandmother begins to speak. Her voice is soft, barely above a whisper. But in the quiet intimacy of the lodge, every word is clear. She is telling a story, one you have heard before, but which never loses its power. It is the story of a winter long ago, before you were born, when the cold came early and stayed late, and the buffalo moved south beyond the reach of the hunting parties. That winter, she says, many people died, not from the cold, but from hunger, and from the weakness that hunger brings, which makes the cold even more deadly. But her family survived, she says, because her grandmother knew the old ways, knew which roots could be dug even from frozen ground, knew how to make broth from boiled bones that would keep strength in the body, even when there was no meat, knew how to keep the fire burning efficiently when fuel was scarce, and every buffalo chip had to last twice as long as usual. The story is not about bravery or adventure. It is about knowledge, about the tiny details that mean survival, how to position your sleeping robes to share maximum warmth, how to breathe shallow when the cold is deepest to avoid hurting your lungs, how to keep your feet from freezing by stuffing grass into your moccasins to create insulation, how to read the signs in smoke and flame that tell you the fire needs adjustment before it becomes a problem. As she speaks, you realize that this is not just a story. It is teaching, the most important kind. She is passing down the wisdom that kept her alive so that you might survive your own hard winters someday. Every family has these stories, these repositories of knowledge encoded in narrative so they can be remembered and retold. Generation after generation, the accumulated experience of hundreds of winters distilled into words that a child can understand and remember. Outside, the wind has risen. You can hear it now, a low moan that makes the lodge poles creak slightly in their lashings. The temperature is dropping rapidly as the night deepens. By morning, the leather water bags will be frozen solid. The entrance flap will have frost on its inner surface. Anyone who ventures outside will face cold that can kill in minutes. But inside, the fire burns steady. The stones radiate their stored heat. The double wall construction keeps the worst of the cold from penetrating, and 8 people, sitting together in the warm circle of family, prepare for another night of survival that will look, from the inside, remarkably like comfort. Your mother begins banking the fire for the night, an art that has taken her years to master. She is arranging the coals in a specific pattern, placing larger pieces where they will burn slowest, creating a configuration that will maintain heat for 8 or 9 hours without requiring attention. Too much fire means waking in a smoke-filled lodge with burning eyes and aching lungs. Too little means waking cold, if you wake at all. She adds buffalo chips in a careful spiral, working from the outside in, each chip positioned to catch from its neighbor as it burns. Then she adds 2 large pieces of cottonwood, placing them where the heat is most intense but not so close they will burst into flame. The goal is long, slow combustion that produces steady heat rather than dramatic flames. Around the fire pit, she adjusts the heated stones, moving some closer to the sleeping areas, positioning others where they will continue to absorb heat from the coals and radiate it throughout the night. Each stone is handled with respect, touched gently to test its temperature, moved with tools rather than bare hands when it is too hot to handle safely. The sleeping arrangements begin with the youngest and oldest. Your baby brother, in his cradleboard, is positioned closest to the fire, but shielded from sparks by a carefully placed hide screen. Your grandmother's sleeping place is prepared with extra robes and with 2 heated stones, wrapped in thick leather, placed where they will warm her feet and her back. The cold is hardest on the very old, and special care is taken to ensure she will sleep comfortably. Your parents sleep on one side of the lodge, you and your sisters on the other, arranged so that each person benefits from the body heat of those beside them. The robes are not individual blankets, but shared coverings, overlapping and interconnected, so that warmth generated by one body helps keep the others comfortable. You sleep with your feet toward the fire, your head toward the outer wall where it is coolest, but your body heat mingles with your sisters, creating a warm microclimate under the shared robes. Before sleep, your father checks the smoke hole covers, the two flaps of hide at the top of the lodge that can be adjusted from inside using long poles. Tonight, with the wind from the north, he positions them to catch the breeze and create a draft that will draw smoke up and out, while preventing downdrafts that could blow smoke back into the living space. This adjustment is crucial. Too much draft and heat escapes unnecessarily. Too little and smoke accumulates, making breathing difficult and coating everything with soot. Your mother checks the entrance flap, making sure it is secured against the wind, but not so tightly that no fresh air can enter. The balance is delicate. People breathing in a sealed space will eventually consume the oxygen and create dangerous levels of carbon monoxide from the fire. Fresh air must circulate, but slowly, controlled, warming as it enters rather than creating drafts that steal heat. The final ritual before sleep is your father's quiet prayer, spoken in words so soft you can barely hear them, giving thanks to the buffalo whose hides shelter you, whose chips warm you, whose meat sustains you. Thanks to the wind and the cold for teaching your people to be strong and careful. Thanks to the fire for sharing its warmth. Thanks to the family for their labor and love that makes survival possible. Then silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind outside, the gentle breathing of 8 people settling into sleep. Under your robe, warmth surrounds you. The cold of the day fades from your bones. Your muscles, tight from hours of labor and freezing temperatures, begin to relax. Your mind, alert all day to the constant demands of winter survival, finally quiets. You are warm, not just not cold, but genuinely comfortably warm. The fire has burned down to a gentle glow. The stones radiate steady heat. The double walls create an envelope of protected air. Your family's combined body heat adds to the warmth. And the knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations, has created a home from nothing more than hide and wood and fire and care. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges: more fuel to gather, more water to melt from snow, more careful tending of the fire, more monitoring of the weather, more constant attention to the 100 tiny details that keep cold and death at bay. But tonight, in this moment, you sleep in peace, protected by knowledge that seems miraculous because it works so perfectly it becomes invisible. The last thing you hear before sleep takes you is your grandmother's breathing, steady and slow, the sound of someone who has survived 60 winters and knows she will survive another. The last thing you feel is warmth, genuine and sufficient, created by human wisdom in defiance of a world that seems designed to kill. And then sleep, deep and restful, the kind of sleep that is only possible when you are truly, completely safe. The woman who remembered. The afternoon sun streams through the window of a small house on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. The year is 1912. Outside, the world is changing faster than anyone could have imagined just a generation ago. Automobiles rattle down dirt roads. Telegraph wires carry messages across distances that once took weeks to travel. The buffalo are gone, reduced from millions to a few hundred survivors scattered in parks and private ranches. Inside this modest house, an elderly woman sits across from a younger man with a notebook and a recording cylinder. She is nearly 80 years old, her face deeply lined, her hands gnarled from decades of labor. But her eyes are sharp, her memory precise, and she has agreed to share something precious, the knowledge of how her people lived before everything changed. Her name is Maxidiwak, which means Buffalo Bird Woman, though the government records list her as Wahine. She was born in 1839 in an earth lodge along the Missouri River, raised in the traditional ways of the Hidatsa people, lived through the transition from nomadic freedom to reservation confinement, watched the old knowledge slip away as the young people learned English in boarding schools, and forgot the languages their grandmothers spoke. But she has not forgotten. And now, with patient determination, she is translating a lifetime of survival skills into words that can be written down, preserved, passed on. The ethnographer, Gilbert Wilson, asks her about winter. How did families stay warm in tepees when the temperature dropped to 30 or 40 below zero? How did they survive with nothing but buffalo hides for shelter? Buffalo Bird Woman smiles, the kind of smile that suggests the question itself reveals a misunderstanding. We were not surviving, she says in her language, which Wilson writes down phonetically before translating. We were living. There is a difference. She leans forward, her hands beginning to move as she speaks, shaping the air, illustrating concepts that words alone cannot fully convey. The teepee, she explains, was not just a shelter. It was a system, carefully designed over countless generations, refined through trial and error, perfected until it became something that worked so well, people took it for granted. The choosing of the hides, she begins, started a full year before they would become a lodge. The buffalo had to be killed at the right time, late fall when their coats were thick, but before the deep cold made the hides brittle. The animals had to be healthy, with no scars or thin spots that would create weak places in the lodge cover. The women who selected hides for teepee making had eyes trained by years of experience, able to judge quality at a glance, rejecting any skin that would not perform perfectly under the stress of high winds, extreme cold, and constant use. My grandmother, Buffalo Bird Woman recalls, could walk through a field of drying hides and know immediately which ones were suitable for lodge making and which should be used for other purposes. She would run her hand across the surface, feeling for the right thickness, the right flexibility. A hide that was perfect for clothing might be too thin for a lodge. A hide perfect for a parfleche might be too stiff. Everything had its proper use, and mixing them up could mean disaster. The preparation of lodge hides took weeks. First came the fleshing, scraping away every particle of meat and fat, with tools carved from buffalo leg bones and sharpened to precise angles. This work was done by women working in groups, singing songs that kept the rhythm of their scraping steady and uniform. Buffalo Bird Woman's hands make the motions even now. 70 years later, the muscle memory still intact. The scraping had to remove all the flesh, but not cut through the hide itself, she explains. Too much pressure, and you create a weak spot that will tear under stress. Too little and fat remains, which will rot and destroy the hide from within. Young girls learn by watching, then by working on less important hides, gradually developing the touch that allowed perfect work. After fleshing came the braining, the process that transformed stiff rawhide into supple leather. The buffalo's own brain was used, mixed with liver, bone marrow, and prairie herbs, worked into a paste and rubbed deeply into every part of the hide. This mixture contained natural enzymes that broke down the proteins that made rawhide stiff, while the fats waterproofed the leather and kept it supple even after repeated wetting and drying. The brains of one buffalo are sufficient to tan its own hide, Buffalo Bird Woman says, reciting what sounds like an old proverb. The Creator designed it that way, giving us everything we needed in each animal. The tanning process required days of work. The brain mixture had to be applied, worked in thoroughly, allowed to penetrate. Then the hide had to be worked constantly, stretched and manipulated while it dried, preventing it from becoming stiff again. Women would spend entire days working a single hide, pulling it across wooden frames, kneading it with their hands, sometimes chewing the toughest areas to make them soft. My grandmother said that you could tell the quality of a woman's work by the softness of her lodge hides, Buffalo Bird Woman recalls. A lodge made from well-tanned hides would last for years, shedding rain, resisting wind, maintaining warmth. A lodge made from poorly prepared hides would fail in the first hard storm. Lives depended on the skill of the tanners, but the individual hides were only the beginning. Creating a teepee cover required cutting and sewing multiple hides into a complex pattern that would, when erected, form a cone with specific aerodynamic properties. The pattern had to account for the natural stretch of hide, the way it would shrink and expand with changes in humidity, the stress points where the most strain would occur. The cutting patterns were carried in women's memories, Buffalo Bird Woman explains. There were no written instructions, no diagrams on paper. A master lodge maker could lay out the hides on the ground and cut them to create a perfect lodge without measuring, using only her knowledge of proportions and her understanding of how the hides would behave. The sewing used sinew, the long tendons from the buffalo's back legs, cleaned, split into fine threads, and soaked in water until they became pliable. The needles were carved from bird bones, shaped to points finer than modern steel needles, but strong enough to penetrate multiple layers of thick hide. The sewing had to be perfect, Buffalo Bird Woman remembers, her hands making stitching motions in the air. Every stitch had to be tight and even. Water would find any gap, any loose place, and once water got in, it would freeze and make the hole bigger. We used a specific stitch, an overcast stitch that created a raised seam on the outside that would shed water rather than channeling it into the lodge. But the outer cover, as carefully made as it was, provided only part of the teepee's warmth. The real secret, Buffalo Bird Woman insists, lay in the dew cloth, the inner lining that transformed the simple shelter into a sophisticated heating system. The dew cloth hung from the lodge poles about the height of a man standing, she explains. It did not reach the ground, leaving a gap of perhaps a foot. This created a space between the outer wall and the inner wall, and understanding this space was the key to staying warm. She rises from her chair despite her age, and uses her arms to demonstrate the airflow. Cold air comes in at the bottom. Here, she indicates the gap between the dew cloth and the ground. It cannot come directly into the living space because the dew cloth blocks it. Instead, it is forced to flow up through the space between the inner and outer walls. As it flows upward, it warms slightly from the heat leaking through the inner wall, and it also helps to draw smoke from the fire up and out through the smoke hole at the top. This double wall construction, she explains, created insulation far more effective than a single layer of hide could provide. The trapped air between the walls, warmed by the fire inside and protected from wind outside, acted as a thermal buffer. The constant circulation of air through this space prevented condensation from forming and freezing on the inner surfaces, a problem that could make a single wall shelter dangerously cold and damp. In the coldest weather, we would sometimes add a third layer, Buffalo Bird Woman continues. We would hang additional hides or woven mats outside the main lodge cover, creating another airspace, another layer of insulation. A teepee prepared for deep winter had 3 or 4 layers, each one adding warmth without adding much weight. The management of the dew cloth required constant attention and adjustment. Every morning, you had to check the lining, she says. You had to feel how it hung, whether it was too loose or too tight. If it pressed against the outer wall, you lost the insulating airspace. If it hung too far from the wall, cold air would spill into the living space instead of being channeled upward. You learned to read the signs, the way smoke behaved, the feeling of drafts, the temperature in different parts of the lodge, and you adjusted constantly, tightening ties here, loosening them there, responding to changes in wind direction and temperature. The fire management, she continues, was perhaps the most critical skill of all. The fire had to burn steadily but never too high, she explains. High flames waste fuel and create smoke that hurts the eyes and lungs. Low flames let the cold creep in. You wanted a fire that burned at just the right intensity, producing maximum heat with minimum fuel and minimum smoke. Different types of fuel required different handling. Buffalo chips, the primary fuel on the treeless plains, burned at different rates depending on factors most modern people would never notice. Chips from a buffalo that had been eating sage burned differently than chips from one that had been eating grass, Buffalo Bird Woman explains. Old chips, dried by years of sun and weather, burned slower and hotter than fresh chips. Chips that fell in wet weather and then dried had different properties than those that dried immediately. A skilled firekeeper knew all of these differences and selected fuel accordingly. The arrangement of fuel in the fire pit followed specific patterns. You built the fire in layers, she describes. At the bottom, coal made from hardwood, brought from the mountains, or traded from peoples who live near forests. This coal burned slowly and steadily, providing a base of heat that lasted for hours. Above the coal, you placed buffalo chips, arranged in a spiral pattern so they would burn from the outside in, each chip lighting the next in sequence. The fire was like a clock, burning at a predictable rate, and an experienced woman could tell the time at night by feeling how much fuel remained. The heated stones that ringed the fire pit played a crucial role in the heating system. We selected stones from riverbeds, Buffalo Bird Woman recalls. Certain types of rock hold heat better than others. We learned which stones would crack from heating and which would remain stable. We learned that smooth, dense stones worked better than rough, porous ones. We learned that stones from fast-moving water held heat longer than stones from still pools. These stones were not placed randomly, but in specific patterns designed to maximize thermal efficiency. The largest, densest stones went in the places where they would receive the most heat from the fire. Smaller stones were positioned around the sleeping areas. Some stones were kept near the fire, but not in it, and these could be wrapped in leather and placed directly against the body if someone was especially cold or sick. Buffalo Bird Woman pauses, her eyes distant, seeing something beyond the walls of the modern house. There were techniques we used that I am not sure I can explain in words, she says quietly. Ways of placing stones that created currents of warm air through the lodge. Ways of positioning the dew cloth that channeled heat to exactly where it was needed. My grandmother knew these things, and she tried to teach me, but some knowledge requires living it to understand it fully. She describes nights when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero, when the wind screamed across the prairie with such force it seemed impossible that any structure could stand against it. On those nights, she says, we would do special preparations. We would pile snow against the bottom of the lodge, creating an additional insulation barrier. We would hang extra hides on the windward side. We would heat many stones and bury them in shallow pits around the sleeping area, so the earth itself became a source of warmth. She describes the special care given to the most vulnerable. Babies had to be watched constantly, she says. They could not tell you if they were too cold or too warm. You had to feel their skin, watch their breathing, notice if they seemed uncomfortable. Old people needed extra robes, extra warm food, positions closest to the fire, and sick people required special attention, sometimes including heated stones placed against the body or special teas brewed from stored herbs. The maintenance of the lodge itself was a constant concern. You had to check the ties every few days, Buffalo Bird Woman explains. Wind and weather could loosen them, and a lodge that came loose in a storm could collapse, killing everyone inside. You had to clear snow from around the base so it did not pile too high against the walls. You had to monitor the smoke hole covers, adjusting them as wind direction changed. The lodge was not something you set up and forgot. It required attention every single day. She speaks of the spiritual dimensions of fire and warmth with quiet reverence. Fire was a living thing, she says simply. Not just flames and heat, but something with spirit. You had to respect it, feed it properly, never let it die completely. A dead fire in winter could mean death for the family. So someone always watched it, always kept it alive. The fire was the heart of the family, and as long as it burned, we knew we would survive. When Gilbert Wilson asks about the transition from traditional lodges to reservation houses with wood stoves, Buffalo Bird Woman's expression becomes sad. The houses are easier in some ways, she admits. You put wood in the stove and close the door, and warmth comes. You do not need to understand the wind or the smoke or the careful balance of a lodge, but something was lost. In the lodge, you were always aware of the fire, always tending it, always in relationship with it. The stove is just a machine. You feed it fuel and it produces heat, but there is no art to it, no connection. She pauses, gathering her thoughts. The young people today do not know how to live in a lodge, she continues. They have forgotten the skills their grandmothers knew. If the stove breaks or the coal runs out, they do not know what to do. They have lost the knowledge of how to create warmth from almost nothing, how to survive with only what the earth provides. This knowledge kept our people alive for thousands of years, and in my lifetime, it has almost disappeared. But she does not speak with bitterness, only with the sadness of someone who has witnessed the end of an era. Perhaps it is the way of things, she says. The old ways fade, and new ways come. But I am glad to share what I remember, so that at least someone will know how it was, how we lived in harmony with winter, how we created comfort in the coldest places, how we stayed warm when warmth seemed impossible. As the afternoon light fades and the interview session ends, Buffalo Bird Woman sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind perhaps back in those winter lodges of her youth. The knowledge she has shared will be preserved in Wilson's notes and recordings, fragments of a sophisticated survival system that took thousands of years to perfect and less than a century to lose. Outside the window, the North Dakota prairie stretches toward the horizon, much as it always has. But the tepees are gone, replaced by government houses and agency buildings. The buffalo are gone, replaced by cattle and wheat fields. The people who knew how to stay warm in Buffalo hide lodges are disappearing, one by one, taking their knowledge with them. Buffalo Bird Woman is among the last, and she knows it. But she has done what she can. She has spoken, she has remembered, she has translated lived experience into words. And perhaps someday someone will read those words and understand not just how her people survived winter, but how they transformed survival into an art form. How they created warmth and comfort and home from nothing more than knowledge, skill, and the profound understanding that humans can adapt to almost anything if they learn to work with the world rather than against it. The recording cylinder stops turning, the notebook closes, but the memory remains, preserved now not just in the mind of an elderly woman, but in the permanent record of human ingenuity and adaptation. The knowledge that seemed destined to vanish has been, at least partially, saved. The archaeological mystery. The summer sun beats down on the high plains of Montana. The year is 1967. Dr. Margaret Wheat kneels in the prairie grass, her trowel scraping gently through layers of soil that hold the compressed history of human occupation. Around her, a team of graduate students work carefully, mapping and photographing every artifact, every stone, every fragment of evidence that might help answer the question that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. How did they stay warm? The site they are excavating was once a winter camp, occupied repeatedly over perhaps 2 centuries based on the variety of artifacts and the depth of the deposits. The evidence is clear. People lived here through multiple winters, returned year after year, thrived in conditions that would challenge even modern cold weather gear. But the physical remains tell an incomplete story. The organic materials, the buffalo hides, the wooden lodge poles, the inner linings, and careful ventilation systems. All of these have decomposed, leaving only shadows and echoes for archaeologists to interpret. What remains are stones, hundreds of them, arranged in circles that mark where tepees once stood. Fire-cracked rocks bearing the unmistakable signs of repeated heating and cooling. Patterns in the soil where intense heat has altered the chemical composition of the earth. And layers of ash and charcoal that speak to fires tended with extraordinary care and skill. Dr. Wheat picks up a stone from the fire ring she is excavating. It is a river rock, smooth and rounded, about the size of a large grapefruit. One side shows clear evidence of fire damage, blackened and slightly cracked from thermal stress. But the cracking is superficial, suggesting the stone was used many times without breaking completely. This stone was carefully selected, she explains to her students, not just picked up at random. Someone chose it because they knew it would hold heat well without shattering. That level of knowledge suggests systematic experimentation over long periods of time. The fire ring itself is surprisingly small, no more than 3 feet in diameter, lined with flat stones arranged in a careful pattern. If this fire ring served a lodge that housed 8 to 10 people, Dr. Wheat continues, then the heat output must have been managed with incredible efficiency. The fuel, the airflow, the heat distribution, everything had to work together perfectly. She points to depressions in the soil around the fire ring, shallow pits filled with ash and fragments of burned wood. We think these might have been locations where heated stones were placed, she says. Stones taken from the fire and positioned around the sleeping area to radiate heat throughout the night. But we can only speculate. The people who used these techniques left no written records, and the last people who practiced them are nearly all gone. One of the students, a young man from the Blackfeet Reservation, speaks up. My grandmother told me stories about this, he says hesitantly. She said her grandmother used to heat rocks in the fire and then wrap them in hides. She called them grandmother stones because they took care of you through the night like a grandmother would. Dr. Wheat nods, making notes. Oral history is as important as physical evidence, she says. Often more important because it preserves the knowledge of how things were used, not just that they existed. The problem is that oral history is fragile. Once the people who remember are gone, the knowledge goes with them unless it has been recorded. The excavation continues, revealing more mysteries than it solves. In one area, they find what appears to be a carefully constructed chamber beneath where the lodge floor would have been. It is lined with stones and filled with ash, connected by a narrow channel to the main fire pit. This could be evidence of a radiant heating system, Dr. Wheat suggests. Fire-heated stones in this underground chamber, and the warmed earth radiated heat up into the sleeping area. It would have been incredibly efficient, storing heat for hours after the surface fire died down. But again, we cannot be certain. We are interpreting physical remains without understanding the techniques that created them. She shows her students a sketch of how the system might have worked. If we are right about this, she explains, then the people who built these lodges understood principles of thermal mass and radiant heating that were not discovered by Western science until the 20th century. They were creating sophisticated climate control systems using nothing but stone, fire, and empirical knowledge. The students work carefully, documenting every detail, taking soil samples for chemical analysis, photographing the stone arrangements from multiple angles. Modern archaeology is as much about preserving information as about finding artifacts. Every piece of evidence is potentially important, even if its significance is not immediately clear. As the day wears on and shadows lengthen across the prairie, Dr. Wheat calls the team together for an afternoon discussion. What strikes me most about this site, she says, is not what we have found, but what is missing. There is no evidence of waste, no discarded fuel that was not burned, no broken tools that were not recycled or repurposed. Everything was used completely, efficiently. This speaks to a mindset where nothing could be wasted because everything was precious. She gestures toward the fire ring. Think about what it took to keep that fire burning through a Montana winter. Fuel had to be gathered every day, often from miles away. It had to be stored properly to stay dry. It had to be burned in exactly the right way to maximize heat and minimize smoke. One mistake, one night when the fire was allowed to go out, could kill an entire family. The psychological pressure must have been enormous. But they succeeded, she continues. For thousands of years, people lived in these camps, raised children, maintained their culture, created art and stories and complex social systems. They did not just survive, they built civilizations. And they did it in conditions that we, with all our modern technology, would find extraordinarily challenging. One of the students asks about experimental archaeology. Has anyone tried to actually live in a traditional teepee through a winter to test these theories? Dr. Wheat nods. Some have tried, she says. In the 1950s, a researcher named Reginald Laubin spent several winters living in an authentic teepee in Wyoming. He documented his experiences extensively. According to his reports, when the lodge was properly constructed and managed, the interior stayed comfortable even when outside temperatures dropped below zero. But he also noted that it required constant attention, skill, and knowledge that took years to develop. She pulls out a photograph from Laubin's work, showing the interior of a winter teepee. Notice the dew cloth, she points out. Notice how it creates that crucial airspace between the inner and outer walls. Notice the fire ring lined with stones. Notice the careful arrangement of bedding. Every detail serves multiple purposes. Nothing is there by accident. But here is the problem, Dr. Wheat continues. Laubin was a trained researcher with access to historical documents, photographs, and even some living knowledge keepers. He could study and prepare before attempting winter camping. The people who originally developed these systems had only trial and error, passed down through generations. The knowledge was accumulated over thousands of years, refined through countless experiments, both successful and fatal. Think about the first people who tried to live through a plains winter, she says. Think about the mistakes they must have made, the deaths that resulted from those mistakes. Over time, through painful experience, they learned what worked and what did not. They developed techniques so sophisticated that archaeologists today struggle to understand them fully. This was not primitive survival. This was advanced environmental engineering. The team packs up their equipment as evening approaches. Tomorrow, they will return to continue excavating, documenting, attempting to piece together the puzzle of winter survival on the northern plains. But Dr. Wheat knows that some knowledge cannot be recovered through archaeology alone. That evening, back at their camp, she reviews her notes by lantern light. The stones, the fire rings, the soil patterns, all speak to a level of sophistication that challenges common assumptions about indigenous technology. But between the lines of evidence, in the spaces where organic materials once existed but have now vanished, lie secrets that may never be fully recovered. She thinks about Buffalo Bird Woman, whose recorded interviews she has read many times. She thinks about the elderly knowledge keepers on reservations who still remember fragments of the old ways but are reluctant to share with outsiders. She thinks about the rapid loss of traditional knowledge and the equally rapid expansion of archaeological technique. "We are racing against time," she writes in her journal. "Every year, fewer people remember the living knowledge of these systems. Every year, more sites are destroyed by development, by agriculture, by erosion. We are trying to reconstruct a symphony from scattered notes, trying to understand a language after most of its speakers have died." But she is also optimistic. "Each excavation reveals new evidence," she continues. "Each interview preserves memories that might otherwise be lost. Slowly, carefully, we are assembling a picture of how people adapted to one of Earth's harshest environments. The picture is incomplete, and it may always be incomplete, but it is worth pursuing. Because in understanding how people survived in the past, we may learn lessons applicable to our own uncertain future." She closes her journal and looks out across the darkening prairie. Somewhere out there, beneath the grass and soil, lie the remains of hundreds, perhaps thousands of winter camps. Each one represents families who stayed warm, who raised children, who maintained their way of life in defiance of cold that seems impossible to survive. The stones remember, even if they cannot speak. The earth remembers, even if it requires patient excavation to reveal its secrets. And somewhere, in the memories of elders and the careful notes of ethnographers and the physical evidence slowly emerging from archaeological sites, the knowledge persists. Not complete, not perfect, but preserved, at least partially, against the day when someone might need it again. The social geography of warmth. Winter on the northern plains was not just a season of cold. It was a crucible that revealed and reinforced the social structures that governed every aspect of life. Warmth, perhaps the most precious resource in the world during those frozen months, was never distributed equally. And in its distribution, in the complex calculations of who stayed comfortable and who merely survived, we can read the entire social geography of plains cultures. Picture a Lakota winter camp in January 1859. 43 lodges clustered in the shelter of a river valley on the Powder River. From a distance, the camp might appear to be a random collection of tepees, but closer examination reveals patterns, hierarchies, social networks made visible through the architecture of survival. At the center of the camp, positioned to receive maximum sunlight and sheltered from the prevailing north wind by the natural topography, stands a lodge significantly larger than the others. 24 feet in diameter instead of the usual 12 to 15, constructed from the hides of 18 prime buffalo cows, its cover painted with symbols that tell the story of successful hunts, victories in battle, spiritual visions granted by the Creator. This is the Lodge of White Thunder, a war chief whose influence extends across multiple bands, whose decisions can mean life or death for hundreds of people. The position of his lodge at the geographic center of the camp is not accidental. It reflects his position at the social center of the community. Inside White Thunder's lodge, the differences from ordinary family tepees are immediately apparent to anyone with eyes to see. The fire ring is larger, lined not with randomly selected stones, but with carefully chosen river rocks known for their superior heat retention. The fuel supply stacked along the walls includes not just buffalo chips and cottonwood branches, but precious hardwood brought from the mountains, charcoal made from oak that burns longer and hotter than anything available on the plains. The work of maintaining this superior warmth falls not just on White Thunder's immediate family, but on a network of obligation that extends throughout the camp. Young men seeking to prove their worth arrive daily with armloads of the finest fuel they can find, traveling miles in bitter cold to locate dead cottonwood or to dig buffalo chips from beneath the snow. Women from families allied to White Thunder through kinship or patronage bring prepared foods, firewood they have gathered and dried, even their labor in maintaining the lodge itself. This concentration of resources serves multiple purposes beyond personal comfort. White Thunder's warm, well-lit lodge becomes the center of winter governance, a place where decisions affecting the entire camp are made by people comfortable enough to think clearly, rested enough to consider complex problems, well-fed enough to plan beyond immediate survival. When hunters return from days tracking elk through deep snow, they report first to White Thunder's lodge, where they can warm themselves and share information about game movements, weather patterns, the locations of rival bands. When disputes arise between families, stressed by months of confinement and scarcity, they are resolved in the chief's warm lodge, where anger can cool and reason prevail. When storms trap the camp for days, when food runs low, when sickness spreads through the crowded lodges, White Thunder's superior comfort becomes a community resource. He remains strong while others weaken, alert while others succumb to the lethargy that cold and hunger bring, capable of leadership when leadership is most needed. But this privilege comes with obligations that extend far beyond winter. The families who contribute fuel and labor to the chief's warmth expect reciprocal support during summer hunts, preferential access to good camping sites, advocacy in disputes, material support when their own survival is threatened. The warm lodge becomes a kind of social bank where debts and credits accumulate, creating networks of obligation that bind the community together. Around White Thunder's central lodge, the lodges of his closest allies form a second tier of relative comfort. These are successful hunters, proven warriors, families with strong connections to the chief's network. Their lodges are well positioned to benefit from the microclimate created by proximity to the central fire, their fuel supplies supplemented by gifts from families seeking favor, their comfort level noticeably above that of more peripheral families. Consider the lodge of Runs with Horses, a hunter of legendary skill, whose success provides meat not just for his own family, but for several others who depend on his generosity. His lodge stands 20 feet from White Thunder's, positioned to catch morning sun and sheltered from the worst wind. Inside, the fire burns steadily through the night, tended by younger men who serve as apprentice hunters, learning their craft while contributing labor to the household that feeds them. Runs with Horse's wife, Antelope Woman, is recognized as one of the finest hide tanners in the band. The lodge cover itself is her work, and its quality is evident in how it sheds water, resists wind, maintains warmth. Her skill grants her family a degree of independence and status that translates directly into winter comfort. The lodge is warmer than average not just because of superior positioning, but because of superior construction. Their 3 children sleep in robes made from prime winter buffalo, the thick fur providing insulation that lesser families cannot afford. They eat well even when others go hungry, because their father's hunting skill and their mother's craft work have built relationships throughout the camp. People remember who shared meat in times of plenty, and they reciprocate in times of scarcity. But move outward from this privileged center, and the quality of warmth diminishes perceptibly. In the third tier of lodges, families with fewer connections, less social capital, more marginal status occupy spaces that are physically and socially colder. These are young families not yet established in the social hierarchy, families who have suffered bad luck or made poor decisions, families without powerful relatives or patrons. Their lodges are smaller, less well-positioned, heated by fires that must be tended more carefully and fed more sparingly. Their fuel supplies come from their own labor rather than gifts, meaning more time spent in bitter cold gathering chips and wood, less time for the craft work or social networking that might improve their position. The children in these lodges wear patched clothing, sleep under thin robes, go to bed hungry more often than not. They are not neglected or abused, but the calculus of survival means their comfort ranks lower than that of children in more privileged families. This is not cruelty, but pragmatism, the recognition that in times of scarcity, some must receive less so that the community as a whole can survive. At the outermost edge of the camp, where the wind cuts most sharply and the warmth of communal fires barely reaches, stand the lodges of those who survive on the band's sufferance. Orphaned families with no able hunters, elderly widows whose productive years are behind them, families whose bad fortune or poor judgment has left them dependent on others' charity. Their fires burn low, carefully rationed to make fuel last. Their clothing is threadbare, patched and repatched, Their food is whatever can be spared after more essential families have eaten. They are not outcasts, but they occupy a space at the margins where survival is precarious and comfort is a distant memory. Yet even this apparent inequality serves functions that pure egalitarianism might not achieve. The very existence of a social hierarchy creates incentives for the kinds of excellence in hunting, in craft work, in leadership that benefit the entire community. Young men work harder, take greater risks, develop greater skills, knowing that success brings not just personal reward, but improved comfort for their families. The concentration of resources in the hands of leaders ensures that decision-making capacity is preserved through the season when it is most needed. A chief weakened by cold and hunger cannot lead effectively. A council of elders too focused on immediate survival cannot plan for the future. The social geography of warmth protects the community's ability to function as a coherent unit rather than fragmenting into isolated families focused only on individual survival. And the obligations created by this system generate the social bonds that make cooperation possible. The young man who brings fuel to the chief's lodge today may need the chief's support next year when drought drives away the buffalo or when illness strikes his family. The woman who helps tan hides for a more successful family today may need to borrow food from them next month when her own stores run out. The elderly widow living in a cold lodge at the camp's edge survives because younger families remember that someday they too will be old and dependent on others' generosity. This system was not without its tensions and contradictions. The concentration of warmth in the hands of the powerful could breed resentment, particularly in winters when resources were especially scarce. Families struggling at the margins might question why they should share their meager fuel with those who already had plenty. Young men might challenge the authority of chiefs they saw as hoarding comfort while others suffered. But these tensions were managed through the same social networks that created them. A chief who was too stingy, who failed to redistribute resources adequately, who let families starve while his own lodge remained comfortable, risked losing the respect and support that made his position possible. The system was self-regulating in the sense that extreme inequality could not persist without undermining the cooperation on which survival depended. The winter of 1859 in White Thunder's camp passed without major disaster. The buffalo hunters were successful enough to keep starvation at bay. The cold, while brutal, was not catastrophic. The social networks that distributed warmth unequally but functional held together, keeping most families alive and a few genuinely comfortable. But the memory of that winter, of who stayed warm and who struggled, shaped relationships for years to come. The young man who contributed the most firewood to the chief's lodge gained status that helped him when he sought a wife the following summer. The family that shared food with struggling neighbors earned a reputation for generosity that was repaid many times over in subsequent years. The widow who survived the winter in her cold lodge at the camp's edge remained a living reminder of the community's obligation to care for its most vulnerable members, even if that care was minimal by modern standards. As spring arrived and the lodges came down for the move to summer camps, the social map drawn by winter warmth persisted. The hierarchies made visible by cold weather did not disappear in summer abundance, but rather became less obvious, masked by the relative prosperity that came with grass for horses and buffalo for hunting. But they remained, these patterns of obligation and reciprocity, these networks of patron and client, these calculations of who owed what to whom, and they would be made visible again when the next winter came, when cold once more became the measure of social position, when warmth once more revealed the hidden structures of power and dependence that governed life on the plains. The fire in White Thunder's lodge eventually went out, along with the chief himself and everyone who gathered around that privileged warmth. The camp dispersed, the people moved on, the specific relationships and obligations dissolved into history. But the pattern persisted, repeated in camp after camp, winter after winter, throughout the vast geography of the plains. Warmth was never just warmth. It was power made visible, status made tangible, social structure made concrete. In understanding who stayed warm and how they achieved that comfort, we understand not just the technology of survival, but the sociology of societies that made survival possible under impossible conditions. And perhaps we understand something about our own world as well, about how resources are distributed, about who has access to comfort and who does not, about the complex calculations that determine whose needs are prioritized and whose are deferred. The fires have gone out in those winter camps, but the questions they raise about equality, obligation, and the social organization of survival remain as relevant as ever. The lost sciences. There are moments in archaeological research when you encounter something that challenges your fundamental assumptions about what was possible. For Dr. James Fenimore, that moment came on a cold November morning in 1973, while excavating a winter campsite near the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. His team had been working the site for 3 weeks, carefully documenting what appeared to be a standard winter camp occupied sometime in the early 1800s. The usual artifacts had emerged: fire-cracked rocks, broken tools, the stone circles that marked where lodge poles had stood. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that suggested this site was different from dozens of others scattered across Montana and the Dakotas, until they found the chamber. It appeared first as a subtle depression in the soil, a place where the earth had settled differently than the surrounding matrix. Careful excavation revealed a pit approximately 4 feet deep and 6 feet across, lined with flat stones arranged in overlapping layers like scales on a fish. The stones bore unmistakable signs of repeated, intense heating, their surfaces cracked and discolored from thermal stress. But what made the discovery remarkable was the connection between this underground chamber and the fire ring 10 feet away. A channel, carefully constructed from flat stones, linked the two features in a way that suggested deliberate engineering rather than random arrangement. "This is not just a fire pit," Dr. Fenimore told his assembled team. "This is a heating system, and potentially a sophisticated one." He sketched a diagram in his notebook, hypothesizing about how the system might have worked. If fire was built in the main ring, heated air and smoke would have been drawn down through this channel into the underground chamber. The stones lining the chamber would have absorbed that heat and radiated it upward through the floor of the lodge for hours, perhaps all night. It is essentially a radiant floor heating system, the same principle used in Roman hypocausts and modern heated floors. One of the graduate students, a woman from the Crow tribe named Mary Walks, studied the arrangement carefully. "My great-grandmother spoke of something like this," she said slowly. "She called it warming the mother's bones. I thought it was just a metaphor, a poetic way of describing fires. But perhaps it was literal. Perhaps they really were heating the earth itself." Dr. Fenimore nodded enthusiastically. "If we are correct about this, it represents a level of sophistication in indigenous technology that has not been widely recognized. The physics principles involved, thermal mass, radiant heating, convection currents, these are concepts that Western science did not formalize until relatively recently. Yet, here is evidence that they were being applied practically centuries ago." The team spent the next week carefully excavating and documenting the feature. They found similar chambers at 2 other lodge circles in the same camp, both constructed with slight variations, but following the same basic principle. Chemical analysis of the soil showed evidence of sustained high temperatures, supporting the theory that these were functional heating systems rather than storage pits or refuse areas. But as remarkable as the physical evidence was, it raised more questions than it answered. How widespread were these systems? Why were they not mentioned in historical accounts by fur traders and explorers who visited winter camps? What specific techniques were used to make them function efficiently? And most puzzlingly, why had this knowledge been lost so completely that even descendants of the people who built them were unaware of their existence? Dr. Fenimore spent months researching ethnographic records, searching for any mention of underground heating systems. He found fragments, tantalizing hints, but nothing definitive. A French trader in 1805 noted that some lodges seemed warmer than their construction should allow. A missionary in 1843 commented that the savages possess secrets of warmth which they do not readily share with civilized visitors. An army officer in 1867 observed that the temperature within even the poorest lodge exceeded that which our best heated tents could achieve. But nowhere did he find explicit descriptions of how these systems were constructed or operated. The knowledge, if it had ever been widely shared, had been closely guarded and then lost when the traditional way of life was forcibly ended by reservation policies and the destruction of the buffalo herds. He reached out to elderly knowledge keepers on reservations across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. A few remembered fragments of stories, mentions of special ways of arranging stones or building fires, but the practical details had vanished. One elderly man from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation spoke of his grandmother's grandmother, a woman renowned for keeping the warmest lodge in winter. She had a way of placing stones, he said, that other women tried to copy but never quite matched. She would heat rocks in the fire and then do something with them, some arrangement that made the whole lodge warm even when the fire was just coals. But when she died, the knowledge died with her. My grandmother said it was a shame that something so useful should be lost, but the old woman never taught anyone the secret completely. This pattern of specialized knowledge held by specific individuals and lost when they died appeared repeatedly in Dr. Fenimore's research. The sophistication of teepee heating systems was not universal, but varied dramatically based on the skill and knowledge of the lodge keeper. A master craftsperson could create warmth that seemed miraculous to others. An average person could maintain adequate comfort. A careless or ignorant person could fail entirely, with potentially fatal results. The experimental archaeology that followed the discovery of the underground heating chambers provided some answers, but also revealed the depth of knowledge that had been lost. A team from the University of Montana constructed a full-scale replica teepee according to historical specifications, including an underground stone chamber connected to the main fire pit. The results were mixed. When operated according to best guesses about traditional techniques, the system produced measurable increases in warmth, raising the floor temperature several degrees and extending the duration of usable heat by several hours. But it also proved difficult to manage, requiring careful attention to fuel type, airflow, and the timing of when heated stones were added to the chamber. "We are clearly missing something," the project lead admitted in his final report. "The system works, but not as efficiently as the historical accounts suggest it should. There were techniques, subtle adjustments, specific knowledge about fuel and stone properties that we do not understand. We are operating the system with intellectual understanding, but without the intuitive feel that came from a lifetime of practice." The experimental lodge was occupied through one Montana winter by a volunteer couple, both experienced wilderness campers with training in traditional skills. They maintained detailed logs of temperature, fuel consumption, time spent on maintenance, and comfort levels. Their experiences provided valuable data, but also highlighted the difficulty of replicating traditional knowledge. "We kept warm," the male volunteer reported, "but it required constant attention and learning. Every day we discovered new subtleties, new tricks for improving efficiency. By the end of the winter, we were managing the system much better than at the beginning, but we still felt like amateurs compared to what the historical accounts describe. A lifetime would not be enough to master all the nuances." His partner noted the psychological aspects of the experience. "Modern people are not accustomed to this level of attention to their immediate environment," she wrote. "We had to learn to read tiny signs, the way smoke behaved, the color of flames, the feel of different drafts, the sound the fire made as it consumed different fuels. These are skills that traditional people developed from childhood, so ingrained they became instinctive. For us, it required conscious effort and constant mental processing. The fuel management alone proved to be far more complex than anticipated. Buffalo chips, which constituted the primary fuel on the treeless plains, varied enormously in their burning properties, depending on factors the experimenters had not initially considered important. The age of the chip, the diet of the buffalo that produced it, the moisture content, the season when it was deposited, all of these affected how it burned and how much heat it produced. "We went through a learning curve," the volunteers reported. "Early in the winter, we treated all buffalo chips as essentially identical. But we quickly learned that chips from grass-fed buffalo burned differently than those from animals that had been eating sage. Summer chips that had weathered for years burned differently than fall chips that had dried for only months. Some chips produced quick hot heat, perfect for cooking. Others burned slowly and steadily, ideal for overnight heating. Learning to recognize and use these differences was crucial to efficient operation. The stone management was equally complex. The heated stones that served as thermal batteries required careful selection and handling. Some types of rock cracked or exploded when heated rapidly. Others held heat poorly or cooled too quickly to be useful through a long winter night. The volunteers experimented with stones from different sources: riverbeds versus hillsides, sandstone versus granite versus quartzite, gradually building a collection of rocks with known properties that could be used reliably. We realized that traditional lodge keepers must have maintained collections of stones, carefully curated over years, they noted. Each stone would have been tested, its properties understood, its uses optimized. It was not just a matter of grabbing random rocks from a river. It was materials science, empirical and practical, developed through generations of experimentation. The placement of these heated stones within the lodge required understanding of how heat radiated and how air circulated. Stones placed in one location might create drafts that made some areas uncomfortable. Stones placed elsewhere might interfere with the natural convection patterns that carried smoke out through the smoke hole. The optimal arrangement varied with outside temperature, wind direction, and the specific geometry of the individual lodge. Every lodge was unique, the experimenters reported. Lodge poles of different lengths, hide covers of slightly different thicknesses, positions on different terrain, all of these created variations that required individual solutions. A heating arrangement that worked perfectly in one lodge might need modification in another. This was not standardized technology, but customized engineering adapted to specific circumstances. Dr. Fenimore followed the experimental project closely, visiting several times during the winter to observe and interview the volunteers. He was struck by how much they learned, and yet how much remained unknown. We have recovered perhaps 20 or 30% of the traditional knowledge, he estimated. Enough to survive, enough to stay reasonably comfortable, but not enough to achieve the level of efficiency and comfort that historical accounts describe. He became convinced that some knowledge was probably lost forever. The master lodge keepers, the women and men who truly excelled at creating winter warmth, they possessed skills that went beyond technique into something like art or intuition. They could feel a draft that was barely perceptible. They could judge fuel quality by smell. They could position stones in patterns that created comfort through means we do not fully understand. That level of mastery came from decades of practice, and it cannot be recovered from archaeological remains or experimental reconstruction alone. But he also believed that much could still be learned from the few remaining knowledge keepers. We need to conduct intensive ethnographic work now, while a handful of elders still retain fragments of the old knowledge, he argued. Every year that passes, more is lost. Every elder who dies takes irreplaceable knowledge to the grave. If we do not act now to preserve what remains, future generations will have even less to work with than we do. His advocacy led to several grant-funded projects in the 1970s and 1980s that brought together archaeologists, anthropologists, and indigenous elders to document traditional winter survival techniques. The results were published in academic journals and archived in university collections, preserving at least a partial record of knowledge that was rapidly disappearing. One of the most valuable contributions came from a northern Arapaho elder named Clara Morning Star, who had spent her childhood winters in a traditional lodge in the 1890s before her family was forced onto the reservation. Working with an anthropologist, she provided detailed descriptions of techniques her grandmother had used. Grandmother had special stones that she kept from year to year, Clara recalled. She knew each one, gave them names, treated them almost like living things. She would heat them in specific patterns, some quickly and some slowly. She said different stones had different spirits, different gifts to give. Some were good for long, steady warmth. Others were good for quick heat when someone came in from the cold. She knew them all individually, knew how to use each one for its particular purpose. Clara described the preparation of the underground heating chambers with precision that verified Dr. Fenimore's theories. The stones had to be laid in specific patterns, she explained, not just thrown in randomly. Grandmother would spend days preparing the chamber, selecting stones of specific sizes and shapes, fitting them together so air could flow between them, but heat was trapped. She said it was like building a spirit house for the fire's warmth. And if you built it correctly, the warmth would stay and take care of the family. The fuel management techniques Clara remembered were equally sophisticated. Grandmother could tell what kind of winter was coming by watching the buffalo in autumn, she said. If they grew thick coats early, she knew to gather extra fuel. If they stayed thin longer, she knew it would be a mild winter. She gathered chips all summer and fall, selecting the best ones, storing them in special places where they would stay dry. She never ran out of fuel, even in the worst winters, because she planned months ahead. The clothing strategies Clara described revealed another layer of the survival system. We dressed in layers that could be adjusted constantly, she explained. Grandmother taught me to loosen my clothes before I started to sweat, because moisture was dangerous in winter. She taught me to add layers slowly as evening came, not all at once. She said your body needed time to adjust, that sudden changes were hard on the spirit as well as the flesh. The food management was designed to generate internal heat as much as to provide nutrition. In winter, we ate more fat, Clara remembered. Grandmother would render tallow and add it to everything. She made a special drink from bone marrow and hot water that she said would warm you from the inside. She mixed dried berries with fat and pressed them into cakes that could be eaten cold, but warmed you anyway. The food was medicine, she said, medicine against the cold. Clara's testimony and that of other elders provided crucial information that archaeological evidence alone could never reveal. But even as this knowledge was being documented, the people who held it were dying. Clara Morningstar herself passed away in 1987, taking with her memories and skills that no one else possessed in quite the same way. Dr. Fenimore continued his research until his retirement in 1995, but he always felt he was documenting the end of something rather than preserving a living tradition. "We have fragments," he wrote in his final paper on the subject. Fragments of a sophisticated technology that sustained human life in extreme conditions for thousands of years. We can admire the ingenuity. We can attempt to reconstruct the techniques, but we cannot fully recover the lived experience, the embodied knowledge, the cultural context that made the system whole. He concluded with a reflection that mixed scientific detachment with personal sadness. The loss of traditional heating technology is part of a larger pattern of knowledge loss that accompanies cultural disruption. When people are forced to abandon their traditional ways of life, when children are sent to boarding schools and taught to despise their heritage, when the material basis for traditional practices disappears with the buffalo herds, the knowledge goes with it. We can preserve fragments in books and archives, but the living tradition, the unbroken chain of teaching from grandmother to granddaughter, from master to apprentice, that is broken forever. What remains, he wrote, is evidence of human ingenuity and adaptation that deserves respect and study. The people who developed these heating systems were not primitive savages struggling against nature. They were engineers and scientists in their own right, working with empirical observation and experimental methodology to solve complex problems. They created technology that worked reliably for millennia, technology that we, with all our modern knowledge, struggle to understand and replicate fully. Their legacy, he concluded, is not just the physical remains we excavate or the techniques we document. It is the reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that survival in harsh environments requires not just endurance, but intelligence and creativity, and that the knowledge of how to live in harmony with nature, rather than in opposition to it, is precious and worth preserving, even in fragmentary form. The underground heating chamber, discovered in 1973, was eventually excavated completely, documented in detail, and then carefully backfilled to protect it from erosion and vandalism. It remains there today, beneath the Montana prairie, a silent testimony to engineering principles understood and applied by people whose names are forgotten, but whose ingenuity deserves to be remembered. And somewhere, in archive boxes in university basements, in field notes and photographs and recorded interviews, in the memories of a few elderly people whose numbers diminish with each passing year, the knowledge persists, incomplete, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but real. A window into a way of life that was not primitive but sophisticated, not simple but complex, not a struggle against nature, but a partnership with it. The lost sciences of teepee heating were never truly sciences in the Western sense. They were practical knowledge, empirical wisdom, passed down through generations and refined through centuries of experience. They were skills held in the hands and carried in the memory, understood intuitively rather than intellectually, practiced as art as much as technique. But they were sciences nonetheless, in the truest sense of the word. Systematic observation, experimental methodology, accumulated knowledge, practical application. Everything that defines scientific thinking, present in the work of lodge keepers who never wrote a paper or formulated a theory, but who solved problems of heat transfer, thermal efficiency, and climate control with elegance and sophistication, and now mostly lost, but not entirely, not while a few remember, not while archaeologists continue to excavate and document, not while the stones remain in their circles on the prairie, bearing witness to human ingenuity and adaptation. The fires have gone out in those winter lodges. The last people who truly mastered the heating techniques have passed away, but the knowledge, in its fragmentary form, survives. And perhaps, in understanding what was lost, we can better appreciate what we still have and guard more carefully against the loss of other traditional knowledge systems before they too vanish completely. The gifts of warmth and memory. The winter darkness deepens outside your window as our journey through time approaches its end. You have traveled far tonight, from frozen plains in the 1840s to archaeological sites in the 1970s, from the warm circle of a Cheyenne family lodge to the patient memories of Buffalo Bird Woman, from the social geography of winter camps to the lost sciences that kept people alive in impossible cold. What have you learned? Perhaps that warmth is never simple, never just a matter of heat and shelter. Warmth is knowledge, accumulated over generations. Warmth is skill, practiced until it becomes instinctive. Warmth is cooperation, the sharing of labor and resources and risk. Warmth is hierarchy and obligation, the complex social arrangements that determine who stays comfortable and who struggles. Warmth is art and science combined, intuition and intellect working together to create comfort from the simplest materials. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about what has been lost and what endures. The buffalo are gone from the plains, reduced from millions to a few thousand protected animals. The winter camps are gone, replaced by houses on reservations and in cities. The lodges are gone, except for a few ceremonial structures and museum reproductions. The people who knew how to stay truly warm in buffalo hide shelters are gone, taking most of their knowledge with them. Yet something remains. In the careful notes of ethnographers like Gilbert Wilson, who preserved Buffalo Bird Woman's testimony. In the excavations of archaeologists like Dr. Fenimore, who documented the physical evidence of sophisticated heating systems. In the memories of elders like Clara Morning Star, who shared what they could before they passed. In the experimental archaeology projects that attempt to reconstruct lost techniques. In the stories that are still told, the fragments of knowledge that persist, the recognition that what was lost was valuable and worth remembering, and perhaps in you. Because by listening to this story, by following this journey through history and memory, you have become a carrier of this knowledge, incomplete as it is. You understand now that the teepee was not a primitive shelter, but a sophisticated environmental system. You know that the people who lived in these lodges were not struggling victims of harsh conditions, but capable engineers who had mastered their environment. You recognize that traditional knowledge systems deserve respect as genuine intellectual achievements, not just cultural curiosities. What you do with this understanding is up to you. Perhaps it changes how you think about indigenous peoples, moving past stereotypes of primitive savages to recognize the sophistication and intelligence of traditional cultures. Perhaps it changes how you think about survival and adaptation, understanding that humans are capable of thriving in conditions that seem impossible. Perhaps it changes how you think about comfort and necessity, recognizing that what we consider essential in modern life is actually quite recent and quite fragile. Or perhaps it simply gives you a new appreciation for the warmth that surrounds you now, as you lie in your comfortable bed with your thermostat-controlled heating and your insulated walls. That warmth, too, is a kind of knowledge, the accumulated technology of generations of human invention. It is not superior to the knowledge of teepee heating, just different, adapted to different circumstances, created by different cultures facing different challenges. But both systems, traditional and modern, represent the same fundamental human capacity: the ability to create comfort and safety in a world that does not naturally provide them, the ability to transform resources into shelter, fuel into warmth, knowledge into survival, the ability to care for each other, to share resources and labor, to create communities that protect their most vulnerable members while honoring their most skilled contributors. Think of that young person in 1848, 14 years old, gathering buffalo chips in the bitter cold, carrying fuel back to a lodge where family waits. Think of the mother banking the fire for the night, arranging stones with practiced precision, checking that every family member has adequate covering. Think of the grandmother passing down knowledge through stories, ensuring that hard-won wisdom survives to the next generation. Think of the chief in his warm lodge, using comfort not just for personal pleasure, but as a resource for community leadership. Think of Buffalo Bird Woman in 1912, an elderly woman translating a lifetime of embodied knowledge into words for an ethnographer's notebook, knowing that what she shares may be the only thing that survives of a way of life that is ending. Think of Dr. Fenimore in 1973, kneeling beside an underground stone chamber, recognizing that he has found evidence of engineering sophistication that challenges his assumptions about indigenous technology. Think of Clara Morning Star, sharing memories of her grandmother's special stones, preserving fragments of knowledge that might otherwise disappear completely. All of these people, across all these years, are part of a single story. The story of human adaptation, human ingenuity, human determination to stay warm in cold places, to survive in harsh conditions, to create comfort and community despite challenges that seem insurmountable. And you are part of that story too, because knowledge lives only in the minds that hold it, only in the memories that preserve it, only in the stories that pass it on. By listening tonight, by understanding, by remembering, you help to keep this knowledge alive, if only in fragmentary form. The practical techniques may be lost, the specific skills may be gone, but the essential truths remain. That survival requires wisdom as much as strength. That comfort must be created, not just consumed. That community is built through sharing resources and labor and knowledge. That the most valuable inheritance is not material wealth, but the accumulated wisdom of how to live well in the world as it is. These truths were learned in winter lodges on the frozen plains, but they apply everywhere, in every time, in every situation where humans must work together to overcome challenges. They are worth preserving, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever futures we create. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, surrounded by warmth that comes easily at the turn of a dial, spare a thought for those who created warmth through knowledge and skill and care. Spare a thought for the mothers who tended fires through long winter nights, for the hunters who gathered fuel in bitter cold, for the grandmothers who passed down wisdom through stories, for the communities that stayed warm together when isolation would have meant death. Their fires have gone out, but their legacy burns still, in the memories we preserve, in the respect we hold for their achievements, in the recognition that they were not primitive but sophisticated, not simple but complex, not defeated by harsh conditions, but successful in creating full, rich lives despite those conditions. And perhaps, as you close your eyes and let sleep approach, you can imagine yourself there, in that lodge in 1848, feeling the warmth of the fire, the comfort of the buffalo robes, the security of family gathered close. You can imagine understanding, truly understanding, what it meant to create warmth from almost nothing, to maintain life in conditions designed to extinguish it, to sleep peacefully in the knowledge that wisdom and skill and care have transformed a harsh world into a home. The wind still blows across the plains tonight, just as it did then. But now it finds different shelters, different fires, different dreams of warmth. The buffalo hide lodges are gone, but the principles they embodied endure. The specific knowledge may be lost, but the fact of that knowledge, the proof that it existed and worked for thousands of years, that remains. And in remembering, we honor. In understanding, we preserve. In carrying forward this story, we ensure that the ingenuity and adaptation and determination of those winter lodge keepers is not forgotten entirely, but lives on in our awareness, our respect, our recognition that they achieved something remarkable with resources we would consider inadequate. Rest now in the warmth that surrounds you. Rest knowing that human beings have always found ways to create comfort, to protect each other, to survive and thrive in the harshest conditions. Rest knowing that the warmth you feel is not just heat, but history, not just comfort, but the culmination of thousands of years of human learning about how to live well in a challenging world. The fire burns low. The stones radiate their stored heat. The night deepens toward dawn. And in the space between waking and dreaming, between past and present, between the cold outside and the warmth within, sleep comes gentle and complete. Thank you for joining me on this journey through winter and memory, through knowledge lost and partially preserved, through the lives of people who stayed warm against impossible odds. If this story has brought you comfort, if it has taught you something new, if it has helped you appreciate the warmth that surrounds you now, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I share stories like this several times a week, each one designed to help you wind down at the end of the day, to fill your mind with history and wonder instead of worry and stress, to carry you gently toward restful sleep. Leave a comment if you wish, sharing your thoughts about tonight's journey, or suggesting topics for future explorations. This community of late-night history lovers grows with each person who joins, and I am grateful for every one of you. Until we meet again in another time, another place, another story, may your nights be warm and your sleep be deep. May the knowledge of how people survived and thrived in harsh conditions give you comfort in your own challenges. May the memory of those winter lodges, warm against the frozen night, remind you that human beings are capable of remarkable things when we combine wisdom, skill, and care. The embers fade to darkness. The story settles into dreams. The ancient knowledge rests in modern memory. And somewhere, on the wind that crosses the plains tonight, perhaps the ghosts of those winter camps still gather, still tend their careful fires, still wrap themselves in buffalo robes and sleep warm, knowing that they did what seemed impossible. They stayed warm in buffalo hide shelters. They raised children and maintained communities in extreme cold. They created comfort from knowledge and skill and determination. And though their specific techniques may be mostly lost, their achievement remains, testimony to human capacity for adaptation, ingenuity, and survival. Sleep well, knowing that you carry their story now, that their legacy lives in your understanding, that the warmth of winter lodges, though vanished from the physical world, persists in memory and honor and respect. Good night, and may tomorrow bring its own warmth and wonder.